The sun rose bright and clear over New York City. On September 11th, 2001, it was a Tuesday morning that started like any other day. The twin towers of the World Trade Center stood tall against the blue sky. These buildings were symbols of American business and success. They reached 110 floors into the sky. Inside these towers, about 50,000 people worked every day. On this morning, thousands of people were already at their desks or riding elevators to their offices. Flight 175 was another plane heading from Boston to Los Angeles. Flight 77 was leaving Washington, D.C. for Los Angeles. Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The plane hit between floors 93 and 99. The sound was like nothing anyone had ever heard before. Windows shattered. The building shook. Smoke was filling the upper floors. Some people went to the roof hoping for helicopter rescue. Others broke windows to get fresh air. Many people made phone calls to their families to say goodbye. People on the streets below looked up in shock and confusion. Flight 93 was getting ready to fly from Newark, New Jersey, to San Francisco. Fire trucks and ambulances were racing to the scene with their sirens blaring. At the Pentagon, military officers and civilian workers were at their desks. This building was the heart of American defense. Five-sided and massive, the Pentagon housed the offices of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. About 23,000 people worked there every day. Firefighters were getting their equipment ready and preparing to climb up into the burning tower to save people. The plane hit the building's west side and caused massive damage. Part of the building collapsed. Smoke and flames filled the offices. Thousands of people were buried under the rubble. The dust was so thick that people could not see across the street. Ordinary people became heroes. Firefighters ran into burning buildings when everyone else was running out. Police officers stayed to help people evacuate instead of saving themselves. In the days and weeks that followed, Americans would hear incredible stories of courage, sacrifice, and love. These stories would show that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit can shine brightly. Office workers carried injured strangers down flights of stairs. Boat captains brought their vessels to Manhattan to evacuate people from the island. Military personnel and civilians worked together to evacuate the building and rescue people who were trapped. Heroes are regular people who choose to help others when things are at their worst. Heroes are people who run toward danger instead of away from it. Heroes are people who put other lives before their own. News reporters on television were calling it a terrible accident. They realized their plane was also being used as a weapon. But unlike the passengers on the other flights, the people on Flight 93 decided to fight back. Nobody wanted to believe that someone had done this on purpose. At 9:59 in the morning, the South Tower collapsed. The massive building fell straight down in a cloud of dust and debris. People on the streets ran for their lives as the dust cloud chased them down the narrow streets of Lower Manhattan. He and other passengers decided they would try to take control of the plane. Before they acted, Todd said a prayer with a phone operator. His last words were, "Let's roll." These two words became a symbol of American courage and determination. These were normal flights that happened every day. Passengers were reading newspapers, talking on phones, and settling in for cross-country trips. The passengers had fought the attackers and prevented them from reaching their target, which was probably the U.S. Capitol building or the White House in Washington, D.C. By fighting back, these brave people saved hundreds or maybe thousands of other lives. People were drinking their morning coffee and rushing to catch trains and buses. The stairwells were dark and filled with smoke. People helped each other. Strangers became friends. Office workers shared water with each other. People with injuries were carried down by others they had never met before. On the upper floors, workers could see the beautiful view of New York Harbor and the Statue of Liberty in the distance. On board were 81 passengers and 11 crew members. Most of them were business travelers going to California for meetings. Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower. This plane hit between floors 77 and 85. Now everyone knew this was an attack. The Twin Towers, symbols of American strength, were both on fire. Black smoke was pouring out of the buildings and drifting across the Manhattan skyline. Office workers were hanging white shirts and papers out of windows to signal for help. Two planes hitting two buildings could not be an accident. Fear spread through the city and across the country. Others were families starting vacations. The pilot, Captain John Agonovsky, was an experienced flyer who had been with American Airlines for many years. Nobody on that plane knew they were about to become part of something terrible. The morning was so clear that people could see for miles in every direction. Office workers were heading to their desks high up in the towers of the World Trade Center. Parents were dropping their children off at school. Nobody knew that this beautiful autumn morning would change America forever. At 8:30 in the morning, the streets of Lower Manhattan were busy with people going to work. In the North Tower, people were starting their workday. Some were checking emails, others were getting ready for morning meetings. Meanwhile, at Logan International Airport in Boston, Flight 11 was getting ready to take off. The American Airlines plane was heading to Los Angeles. At the same time, 3 other planes were also preparing for routine flights. At 8:46 in the morning, everything changed in an instant. At first, many people thought it was an accident. Maybe the pilot had a heart attack. Maybe something went wrong with the plane controls. Inside the North Tower, people above the impact zone were trapped. The plane had destroyed the stairways and elevators. Below the impact zone, thousands of people began walking down the stairs to evacuate. On the streets of New York, people were pointing up at the burning building. Some were taking pictures. Others were calling their families. Then at 9:03 in the morning, something happened that proved this was not an accident. People watching on television could not believe what they were seeing. In Washington, D.C., people were also starting their normal Tuesday morning. But at 9:37 that morning, Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon. Meanwhile, Flight 93 was still in the air. The passengers on this plane had learned about the other attacks through phone calls to their families. Todd Beamer, a businessman from New Jersey, was one of the passengers who made a plan to stop the attackers. At 10:03 that morning, Flight 93 crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. Back in New York, something unthinkable happened. 29 minutes later, at 10:28, the North Tower also collapsed. Both of the twin towers were gone. The New York City skyline was changed forever. But in all this darkness and terror, something beautiful also happened. This was the morning that changed everything. It was the day America learned that heroes are not just people in movies or history books. The events of September 11, 2001 brought out the worst in some people, but they also brought out the very best in many others. This is the story of those heroes and the people they saved. When most people were running away from the burning World Trade Center towers, thousands of brave men and women were running toward them. These were the first responders, firefighters, police officers, paramedics, and emergency workers who had trained their whole careers for moments like this. They knew the buildings were dangerous, but they also knew that people inside needed help. So they grabbed their equipment and rushed into harm's way. The first fire trucks arrived at the World Trade Center. Just minutes after the first plane hit the North Tower, Captain Patrick Brown was one of the first firefighters on the scene. He looked up at the massive building with smoke pouring from the upper floors and knew this would be unlike anything he had ever faced. Captain Brown had been a firefighter for 21 years. He had fought fires in apartment buildings, warehouses, and office towers. The building shook so hard that some firefighters were knocked off their feet, but they got back up and kept climbing. Lieutenant Cross radioed to his men, "Stay together and keep moving up. There are people who need us." But nothing had prepared him for this. Captain Jonas had a bad feeling about what was happening. He made a decision that saved their lives. He told his men to head back down immediately. Captain Brown quickly organized his men from Ladder Company 3. They put on their heavy gear, grabbed their axes and breathing equipment, and headed into the North Tower. On their way down, they met a woman named Josephine Harris, who could not walk very fast. She had hurt her leg and was moving very slowly. They were buried under tons of concrete and steel, but they were alive. They spent hours calling for help until other rescue workers found them. They were some of the last people pulled out of the rubble alive. The firefighters could have left her behind and saved themselves, but that was not what firefighters do. They stayed with Josephine and helped her down the stairs step by step. They set up medical stations near the World Trade Center to treat injured people. When the towers collapsed, many paramedics were caught in the dust clouds. He was on the 35th floor of the North Tower, still trying to reach people who were trapped higher up. His final radio message was calm and professional, just like he had been trained. Captain Brown and the men from Ladder Company 3 never made it out of the building. They kept working, even when they could barely breathe. Some paramedics went into the rubble pile to look for survivors, even though it was extremely dangerous. It is estimated that the actions of firefighters, police officers, and other emergency workers saved thousands of lives that day. They helped evacuate both towers before they collapsed. They carried injured people to safety. They stayed calm under pressure and did their jobs even when they knew their own lives were in danger. This was the largest loss of life for firefighters in a single day in American history. It showed that there are still people willing to put their lives on the line for strangers. It proved that heroism is not just something you see in movies, it is something that ordinary people do when extraordinary circumstances require it. These memorials remind everyone that there are people who choose to run toward danger so that others can run to safety. They are the first responders, and they are true American heroes. These men came from fire stations all over New York City. Some were young firefighters who had just started their careers. Others were veterans who were close to retirement. All of them died trying to save other people. Their job was to climb the stairs and reach the people trapped on the upper floors. The firefighters would step aside to let civilians pass, then continue climbing up. Ladder Company 3 lost all 6 men who went into the North Tower. Squad 252 lost all 8 of their firefighters. Rescue Company 1 lost all 5 members of their team. These were not just numbers. These were fathers, sons, brothers, and friends who would never come home. These officers knew the buildings better than anyone. When the attacks started, they immediately began helping people evacuate. Sergeant John McLaughlin was leading a team of Port Authority officers into the buildings when both towers collapsed. He and Officer Will Jimeno were trapped under the rubble for many hours before rescue workers found them. But these families continued to support each other and honor the memory of their loved ones. They started foundations to help other first responder families. They made sure that people would always remember the sacrifice their loved ones made. Many firefighters were already breathing hard from the climb, but they kept going. They encouraged the office workers they met. "You're doing great," they would say. "Keep going down. You're almost out." He was supposed to start a new job, but when he heard about the attacks, he put his police uniform back on and headed to the World Trade Center. Officer Perry was last seen helping people evacuate from the South Tower. He never made it out. Each firefighter was carrying about 60 pounds of equipment. They knew it would be a long, hard climb to reach the people who needed help. As more fire trucks arrived, the scene became organized chaos. Fire chiefs were setting up command posts on the street. All over New York City, officers were directing traffic away from Lower Manhattan and helping people stay calm. Many officers worked for 24 hours straight without a break. They set up roadblocks to keep people safe and helped families who were looking for missing loved ones. They were trying to figure out how many people were in the buildings and where firefighters should go first. Radio calls were coming in from all over the city as more firefighters rushed to help. Lieutenant Mickey Cross was leading his men from Engine Company 16 into the South Tower when the second plane hit. Inside the stairwells, firefighters were meeting office workers who were coming down. One group of firefighters that became famous was the men from Ladder Company 6, Captain John. Jonas was leading 5 other firefighters up the North Tower when they heard a rumbling sound. The firefighters from Ladder Company 6 were on the 27th floor when they started going back down. When the North Tower collapsed, the 6 firefighters and Josephine Harris were in a small section of Stairwell B that did not get crushed. Police officers were also rushing to help that morning. Officer John Perry had just retired from the New York Police Department the day before September 11th. The Port Authority police were responsible for security at the World Trade Center. Police officers were not just helping at the World Trade Center. Paramedics and emergency medical workers were also heroes that day. Captain Patrick Brown, who had led his men into the North Tower that morning, was last heard from on his radio at 9:57 a.m. In total, 343 firefighters died at the World Trade Center that day. The New York City Fire Department lost entire companies that day. But the sacrifice of these first responders was not in vain. The families of first responders showed incredible strength in the days after September 11th. Many wives became widows. Children lost their fathers. The courage of first responders on September 11th inspired people all over America. Today, firehouses all over New York City at memorials to the firefighters who died on September 11th. Police stations honor the officers who gave their lives. Inside the World Trade Center towers on September 11th, thousands of people were living through the most frightening moments of their lives. These were office workers, security guards, janitors, and visitors who found themselves trapped in buildings that were on fire and falling apart. But even in this terrible situation, many people showed incredible courage. They helped strangers, shared water and food, and stayed calm when everything around them was chaos. Stanley Premnath was sitting at his desk on the 81st floor of the South Tower when he saw something that made his blood run cold. Through his office window, he could see an airplane flying straight toward his building. Stanley had only seconds to react. He dove under his desk just as Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower. The ceiling had fallen down, and there was debris everywhere. The wing of the airplane had come through the wall of his office. Stanley was cut and bleeding, but he was alive. He started calling for help, but nobody could hear him over the noise of the fire and the groaning of the damaged building. Wells worked for a company called Sandler O'Neill on the 104th floor. When the first plane hit the building, Wells could have just saved himself. On September 11th, he used that bandana to cover his nose and mouth so he could breathe in the smoky stairwells. People who survived remember seeing a young man in a red bandana who kept going back up the stairs to help more people get down. Instead, he decided to help others get out safely. The plane hit just a few floors above where Stanley was hiding, carried others who could not walk on their own. He showed people where the stairs were when they could not see through the smoke. Rick was a former soldier who had fought in the Vietnam War. He had always worried that the World Trade Center could be attacked, so he had prepared his company for emergencies. Rick made all the Morgan Stanley employees practice evacuating the building several times every year, or calling their families to say goodbye. These phone calls were heartbreaking, but they also showed the love and strength of ordinary people facing death. Parents called their children to tell them to be good and study hard in school. Some people were calm and comforting on the phone, trying to make their families feel better even though they knew they might not survive. She started walking down the stairs with her coworkers, but the journey was slow and difficult. The stairwells were crowded with people and smoke was making it hard to breathe. Janelle kept walking down floor after floor, step after step. Rick was last seen on the 10th floor, still helping people evacuate. He was singing songs to keep people calm and telling them that everything would be okay. Again and again, they chose to help. Office workers carried injured strangers down flights of stairs. People shared their cell phones so others could call their families. Some people gave up their spots in evacuation lines so that pregnant women or elderly people could go first. Rick saved thousands of lives, but he gave up his own life to do it. They were accountants, secretaries, computer programmers, and managers who suddenly found themselves in a life-or-death situation. But they responded with courage and kindness. They proved that heroism does not require special training or superhuman strength. Sometimes being a hero just means helping the person next to you when they need it most. But she kept praying and believing that someone would find her. Finally, rescue workers heard her voice and dug her out. In the worst possible circumstances, people chose love over fear, helping over selfishness, and courage over cowardice. These ordinary people became heroes simply by caring about each other when it mattered most. Janelle was the last person pulled alive from the wreckage of the World Trade Center. Wells saved many lives that day, but he never made it out of the building himself. Just as she sat down to remove her shoes, the building began to collapse. Janelle was buried under tons of concrete and steel, but a small pocket of space around her kept her from being crushed. People called him the man in the red bandana, until his family was able to identify him from the stories that survivors told. Ryan worked for Eurobrokers and was trying to evacuate with his coworkers. When he heard someone shouting, Brian made a decision that saved Stanley's life. Instead of continuing down the stairs to safety, Brian went looking for the voice. When Stanley crawled out from under his desk, his office was destroyed. Many people did not want to leave because their building had not been hit yet. "We can do this," they would say. "Just one more floor. Stay with me. We're almost there." These words of encouragement helped people find the strength to keep walking down when they were exhausted and scared. But Rick insisted, He walked through every floor of the South Tower with a bullhorn, telling people to get out immediately. Together, they moved pieces of concrete and twisted metal until Stanley could squeeze through. The two men had never met before, but Brian risked his own life to save a complete stranger. Office workers who had bottles of water gave drinks to people who were thirsty. Nobody was pushing or shoving. Everyone understood that they were all in this together. They made their way to the stairs and began the long journey down from the 81st floor. On the other side of the impact zone, a man named Brian Clark heard Stanley calling for help. Brian found Stanley trapped behind a wall of debris. As they walked down the stairs, Stanley and Brian met hundreds of other people who were evacuating. Everyone was helping each other. People with flashlights shared them with others. In the North Tower, a young man named Wells Crowther was also helping people evacuate. Wells always carried a red bandana that his father had given him when he was a child. Wells made several trips up and down the stairs. He helped injured people walk down. Another hero in the towers was Rick Rescorla, who worked as the head of security for Morgan Stanley. When the first plane hit the North Tower, Rick immediately ordered all 2,700 Morgan Stanley employees to evacuate the South Tower. Because of Rick's quick thinking and preparation, almost all of the Morgan Stanley employees got out of the South Tower before it collapsed. High up in the North Tower, people who were trapped above where the plane hit were making the most difficult phone calls of their lives. Many people called their spouses to say, "I love you one last time." Janelle Guzman McMillan was working on the 64th floor of the North Tower when the building was hit. When Janelle reached the 13th floor, she decided to take off her high-heeled shoes because they were hurting her feet. Janelle was trapped in the rubble for 27 hours. She could not move her legs, and she was very thirsty and scared. Throughout both towers, people were making choices about whether to help others or save themselves. In the stairwells, people were encouraging each other to keep going. Many people in the towers that day had never experienced anything like this before. The voices from the towers on September 11th tell us about the very best of human nature. On the morning of September 11th, United Airlines Flight 93 was supposed to be just another routine flight from Newark, New Jersey, to San Francisco, California. The plane was carrying 33 passengers and 7 crew members. These were ordinary people going about their normal lives, business travelers heading to meetings, a grandmother visiting family, college students going back to school. Todd was married to Lisa, and they had 2 young sons named David and Drew. Lisa was pregnant with their 3rd child. Todd was traveling to San Francisco for a business meeting and planned to be back home by Thursday for his son's baseball game. None of them knew they were about to become some of the greatest heroes in American history. He brought along some work to do during the flight and a book to read. Todd was the kind of person who talked to the people sitting near him. He was friendly and made friends easily. The other passengers on Flight 93 would soon learn that Todd was also incredibly brave. Todd Beamer was one of the passengers on Flight 93. He was 32 years old and worked for a computer company called Oracle. For the first 46 minutes, Flight 93 was a normal flight. The passengers were reading, working on their computers, and talking quietly. The flight attendants were serving breakfast and drinks. For men who had been sitting quietly suddenly attacked the pilots and flight attendants. These were the same kind of attackers who had taken over the other 3 planes. They had knives and claimed they had a bomb. They forced their way into the cockpit and took control of the airplane. He was a big, strong man who had been a college wrestler. Jeremy was married to Liz, and they had a 3-month-old baby daughter named Emmy. Jeremy was excited to get home to California to see his wife and baby. They said they were taking the plane back to the airport. But the passengers on Flight 93 were different from the passengers on the other flights. They had cell phones and airplane phones, and they started calling their families. Through these phone calls, they learned that other planes had crashed into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Jeremy asked Liz what she thought he should do. Liz told Jeremy about the attacks on the World Trade Center. She was brave and strong. Sissy called her husband Lauren and left him a message saying that the plane had been taken over. She told Lauren that some of the passengers were talking about fighting the attackers. She told him that other passengers should work together to try to take back the plane. Jeremy agreed that they had to do something. Todd told Lisa that he and the other passengers were going to try to take back the plane. Todd asked Lisa to pray with him. Together, they said the Lord's Prayer. Then Todd said something that became famous all over America. He said, "Are you ready?" Okay, let's roll. They decided they would try to rush the cockpit and take back control of the plane. They knew it was very dangerous, but they also knew they had no choice. If they did nothing, the attackers would crash their plane into a building and kill many innocent people. When Todd got on the plane that morning, he sat in seat 3, 2D. Jeremy Glick, Mark Bingham, Tom Burnett, Cece Lyles, and all the other heroes of Flight 93 proved that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they work together. People from all over America come to visit and remember the passengers and crew who gave their lives to save others. Their story reminds us that heroes are not just people we read about in books. Sometimes heroes are sitting right next to us, and we only discover their courage when the world needs it most. Tom said they could not let the attackers use their plane to hurt people on the ground. Dina told Tom she loved him, and Tom said he would see her later. By fighting back, they prevented the attackers from reaching their target. Investigators believe the attackers planned to crash Flight 93 into either the U.S. Capitol building or the White House in Washington, D.C., because of the courage of the passengers. Hundreds, or maybe thousands of people in Washington were saved. They rushed toward the cockpit where the attackers were flying the plane. The attackers realized they were losing control of the situation. Phone calls from the plane recorded the sounds of the fight. People could hear passengers yelling and fighting. Todd stayed on the phone with Lisa and told her about the attackers and their plans. At 10:03 in the morning, Flight 93 crashed in an empty field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. All 40 people on board died in the crash. Lisa told Todd about the other attacks in New York and Washington. Todd realized that his plane was also going to be used as a weapon to hurt innocent people. Jeremy Glick was another passenger on Flight 93. Jeremy was 31 years old and had been visiting his family in New Jersey. Their loved ones had made the ultimate sacrifice to save others. They had shown that Americans will fight back when someone tries to hurt innocent people. Tom was 38 years old and had 3 daughters. He worked for a medical device company and traveled often for his job. Tom was smart and quick-thinking. His wife Dina always said that Tom was the kind of person who would help anyone in trouble. He said that some bad people had taken over the plane. Mark's phone call was cut short, but his mother could tell that Mark was getting ready to fight back. Mark Bingham was also on the plane. Mark was 31 years old and owned his own business. He was tall and athletic and had played rugby in college. Mark had been in New York for his grandmother's funeral and was heading back to San Francisco where he lived. Mark was known for being brave and standing up for people who needed help. Tom Burnett was a businessman from California who was returning home after meetings in New York. The flight took off from Newark at 8:42 in the morning, just a few minutes before the first plane hit the World Trade Center in New York. But at 9:28 in the morning, everything changed. The attackers told the passengers to stay in their seats and be quiet. Todd Beamer called the airplane phone operator and told her what was happening. The operator's name was Lisa Jefferson. Jeremy Glick called his wife Liz and told her that the plane had been taken over. Mark Bingham called his mother Alice and told her he loved her. Tom Burnett called his wife Dina several times. In their last phone call, Tom told Dina that he and some other passengers were going to do something. Cece Lyles was a flight attendant on Flight 93. Cece had become a flight attendant after working as a police officer. The passengers on Flight 93 made a plan. Todd Beamer was still on the phone with operator Lisa Jefferson. At 9:57 in the morning, the passengers of Flight 93 fought back. The attackers decided to crash the plane rather than let the passengers take it back. But the passengers of Flight 93 had won their fight. The families of the Flight 93 passengers and crew members were heartbroken, but they were also proud. Todd Beamer's words, "Let's roll," became a symbol of American courage. The empty field in Pennsylvania where Flight 93 crashed became a memorial to these heroes. The Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, is one of the most important buildings in America. It is the headquarters of the United States military and the largest office building in the world. On September 11, 2001, about 23,000 people were working inside this massive 5-sided building. Most of them were military officers, civilian employees, and contractors who helped keep America safe every day. At 9:37 in the morning, American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the west side of the Pentagon. The plane was traveling at over 500 miles per hour when it hit the building. The impact was so powerful that it destroyed part of the Pentagon and started huge fires throughout that section of the building. The plane hit just a few hundred feet away from where Victor was sitting. Victor could not move the concrete by himself, so he called for help. Together with other Pentagon workers, Victor lifted the concrete and carried Antoinette to safety. The explosion knocked him out of his chair and filled his office with smoke and debris. Victor could have run outside to safety, but that is not what he did. His office was very close to where Flight 77 crashed. When the plane hit, General Jansen was thrown across his office. His clothes were torn, and he was bleeding from cuts on his face and hands. General Jansen got up and immediately started organizing rescue efforts. Each time he found more people who were trapped or injured. Victor helped evacuate dozens of people that day. He did not think about his own safety, walked with her to make sure she was safe. Even though General Jansen was injured himself, he took the time to comfort Sheila and tell her that everything would be okay. This is the kind of leadership that military officers are trained to show, but General Jansen showed it when it mattered most. Made sure that everyone in nearby offices knew they needed to evacuate. Colonel McNair helped carry an injured woman down 2 flights of stairs. But instead, he stayed at the Pentagon to help with rescue operations. He worked with firefighters and medical teams who were trying to find people who might still be trapped inside the building. Colonel McNair worked for many hours that day, long after his own safety was no longer in danger. He shared his water bottle with people who were thirsty from walking through the smoky hallways. He went from office to office, making sure that everyone knew they needed to leave immediately. Captain Tarantino helped elderly civilian workers who had trouble walking quickly. He carried important computer equipment for people who could not manage it themselves. He started giving orders to help coordinate the evacuation. He sent some people to check on offices that might have trapped workers. Within minutes of the crash, military officers were setting up command posts outside the building. They were coordinating with local firefighters and police officers. They were making sure that ambulances could get close to the building to help injured people. Captain Tarantino was in a meeting on the 2nd floor when the building shook from the impact. He and the other people in the meeting immediately knew something terrible had happened. He carried stretchers and helped load wounded people into ambulances. Sergeant Major Rose worked side by side with doctors and nurses, doing whatever they needed him to do. He helped treat dozens of injured people, comforted people who were scared and confused. Sergeant Major Rose showed the same dedication to helping people that he had shown as a soldier serving his country. He helped set up a temporary medical station on the Pentagon parking lot. But the number could have been much higher if not for the courage of people like Lieutenant Colonel Correa, General Jansen, Colonel McNair, Captain Tarantino, and Sergeant Major Rose. These military leaders did exactly what they had been trained to do. They put the safety of others before their own safety. He told others to help set up medical stations outside the building. After he had helped evacuate his own area, he went back into the building to look for people who might still be inside. The new section of the building was stronger and safer than before. But the real strength of the Pentagon was not in its concrete and steel. The real strength was in the people who worked there, and their willingness to help each other when help was needed most. The fires were getting worse, and there was always a danger that more of the building might collapse. But Captain Tarantino felt responsible for making sure that no one was left behind. But the building itself is also a memorial to the courage of the survivors who became heroes that day. They showed that the American military is not just about fighting enemies. It is also about protecting and caring for each other. Colonel Philip McNair was working in his office when the building was hit.
Ow.
Sergeant Major Rose had been a soldier for over 20 years. He had served in several wars and knew how to stay calm in dangerous situations. When the Pentagon was attacked, Sergeant Major Rose used his experience to help save lives. Colonel McNair had been in the Army for many years and had served in dangerous places around the world. But he had never experienced anything like this. General Jansen stayed calm and in control, even though everything around him was chaos. All he cared about was making sure that everyone got out alive. Sheila worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency and was on the 1st floor of the Pentagon when the plane crashed. The impact knocked her down and covered her with debris. Sheila was hurt and scared, but she was alive. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Correa was working at his desk in the Pentagon when Flight 77 crashed into the building. Instead, Victor ran toward the crash site to help people who were trapped. He knew that his fellow workers needed help, and he was not going to abandon them. Victor started pulling people out of offices that were filled with smoke. He helped injured people walk to safety. Even when the fires were getting worse and the building was becoming more dangerous, Victor kept going back to look for more people who needed help. Victor found a woman named Antoinette Sherman who was trapped under a heavy piece of concrete. Antoinette worked as a budget analyst for the army. She was unconscious and badly hurt. But Victor was not finished helping people. He went back into the damaged part of the building again and again. Major General John Jansen was the head of the Army National Guard. General Jansen knew that the Pentagon had emergency plans for situations like this. One of the people General Jansen helped was a civilian worker named Sheila Moody. General Jansen found Sheila and helped her get out of the building. Throughout the Pentagon that morning, military officers and civilian workers were helping each other evacuate. Colonel McNair started helping people in his area of the Pentagon get out safely. When Colonel McNair got outside, he could have gone home to his family. Captain David Tarantino was a Navy officer who was working in the Pentagon when Flight 77 crashed. Captain Tarantino took charge of evacuating his section of the Pentagon, but Captain Tarantino did something that showed special courage. One of the most remarkable things about the Pentagon attack was how quickly people organized themselves to help. Sergeant Major Tony Rose was working near the Pentagon's medical clinic when Flight 77 hit the building. Sergeant Major Rose immediately started helping medical personnel treat injured people. Throughout the day, Sergeant Major Rose never took a break. The attack on the Pentagon killed 184 people, including the passengers and crew of Flight 77. The Pentagon was rebuilt within 1 year of the attack. Today, there is a memorial at the Pentagon to honor the people who died on September 11th. On September 11th, heroes were not just the firefighters, police officers, and other professional first responders. Some of the most amazing acts of courage came from ordinary citizens who had never been trained for emergencies. These were boat captains, construction workers, office managers, store owners, and regular people who saw that others needed help and decided to do something about it. One of the most incredible rescue operations that day happened on the water around Manhattan. Captain Thornton worked for a company that moved barges and cargo ships around the harbor. His tugboat was not designed to carry passengers, but when Captain Thornton saw all the people who needed help, he knew he had to do something. When the World Trade Center towers collapsed, thousands of people were trapped on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. The bridges and tunnels were closed and people could not walk or drive off the island. People were standing on the docks and piers, covered in dust and ash from the collapsed buildings. Many of them were scared and crying. Captain Thornton started taking people onto his small tugboat, even though it was only meant to hold a few crew members. When Captain Ardolino heard about the attacks, he immediately turned his boat toward Manhattan. Captain Ardolino spent the entire day taking people off the island. His ferry boat could hold about 100 people, and he made many trips back and forth. The only way out was by boat across the water. Captain Ardolino made sure she had a place to sit down and gave her water to drink. They worked alongside firefighters and police officers to search for people who might be trapped in the rubble. John's crew worked for days without pay, sleeping only a few hours at a time. They wanted to help find survivors, even though the work was dangerous and exhausting. He stayed with her during the boat ride to make sure she was okay. John Vigiano was a construction supervisor who was working on a building project near the World Trade Center. She let people use her phone to call their families. Maria's restaurant became a place where people could rest and clean up before continuing their journey home. Maria spent all of her own money buying extra food and supplies for the people she was helping. His 2 sons were both first responders. One was a firefighter, and the other was a police officer. Both of John's sons had died trying to save people in the World Trade Center. She hugged people who were crying. She brought wet towels for people to clean the dust off their faces. Maria worked for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, to help anyone who came to her restaurant. She said later that helping others was the only thing that made sense to do. The man had hurt his leg badly and could not walk. Dr. Schwartz not only treated his injury, but she also stayed with him until his family came to take him to a hospital. Dr. Schwartz could have gone home to her own family, but she felt responsible for making sure all of her patients were safe. Rabbi Potasnik spent days at the site talking to people who were grieving and scared. He did not try to give them answers about why the attacks happened. He just listened and offered comfort. John channeled his grief into helping the rescue effort. He said that working at Ground Zero was his way of honoring his sons when the attacks happened. James could have driven away from the danger. Instead, he drove toward the World Trade Center to help people evacuate. James gave free rides to anyone who needed to get away from Lower Manhattan. She cleaned wounds with bottled water. She made bandages out of clean clothing. Dr. Schwartz worked with several other doctors and nurses, who also volunteered to help. Together, they showed that people from all backgrounds could come together to help during a crisis. It proved that love and compassion are stronger than hate and fear. You just need to care about other people and be willing to put their needs before your own. Captain Thornton, Maria Santos, Dr. Schwartz, Rabbi Potasnik, James Brady, and thousands of other ordinary citizens proved that heroism comes from the heart, not from a uniform or a job title. Rabbi Potasnik immediately organized members of his congregation to help with relief efforts. His taxi was covered in dust, and the air was hard to breathe, but James kept working. He said that he felt like it was his duty as a New Yorker to help his neighbors during the worst day in the city's history. They collected food, water, clothing, medical supplies to take to rescue workers at Ground Zero. Together, they treated hundreds of people throughout the day, and all the other heroes who had given their lives. When the towers collapsed, Dr. Schwartz immediately set up a medical station outside her office building. She treated people who had been cut by flying glass, or who were having trouble breathing because of the dust. When the towers were attacked, John immediately brought his construction crew to help. This pregnant woman was a complete stranger, but Captain Ardolino treated her like she was part of his own family. Captain Rick Thornton was operating his tugboat in New York Harbor when he heard about the attacks. Captain Thornton brought his tugboat as close to the Manhattan shore as he could get. Maria Santos owned a small restaurant just a few blocks from the towers. When people started running past her restaurant covered in dust and ash, Maria immediately opened her doors. Captain Thornton made trip after trip across the harbor, taking people to safety in New Jersey and Brooklyn. His tugboat was so crowded that people had to stand pressed together, but nobody complained. They were just grateful to get away from the smoke and dust in lower Manhattan. All across New York Harbor, ferry boats, tugboats, fishing boats, and private yachts were racing to Manhattan to help evacuate people. It was the largest water evacuation in history, even bigger than the famous evacuation at Dunkirk during World War II. Captain Thornton worked for hours, till his boat was almost out of fuel. Captain Thornton was not the only boat captain who helped that day. Captain Vincent Ardolino owned a small ferry boat that he used to take tourists to see the Statue of Liberty. One of the people Captain Ardolino helped was a pregnant woman who was having trouble breathing because of all the dust in the air. On land, construction workers became heroes when they used their equipment to help with rescue efforts. John and his workers had heavy equipment like cranes and bulldozers that could move large pieces of concrete and steel. John Vigiano had a personal reason for working so hard at Ground Zero. In the neighborhoods around the World Trade Center, ordinary citizens opened their homes and businesses to help people who were fleeing the area. Maria gave free food and water to anyone who needed it. Maria did not speak English very well, but she did not need words to show kindness. Dr. Susan Schwartz was a pediatrician who had an office in Lower Manhattan. Dr. Schwartz did not have many medical supplies with her, but she used whatever she could find. One of the patients Dr. Schwartz helped was an elderly man who had fallen while running away from the collapsing towers. Rabbi Joseph Potasnik was working at his synagogue in Brooklyn when he heard about the attacks. But Rabbi Potasnik did more than just collect supplies. He went to Ground Zero himself to provide comfort to rescue workers and families who were looking for missing loved ones. Rabbi Potasnik worked with ministers, priests, and other religious leaders from many different faiths. James Brady was a taxi driver who was working in Manhattan on September 11th. James made dozens of trips that day, taking people to hospitals, train stations, and their homes. These unexpected heroes showed that you do not need special training or equipment to help during an emergency. After the Twin Towers collapsed on September 11th, the area where they once stood became known as Ground Zero. This was a place of twisted metal, broken concrete, and thick dust that covered everything like gray snow. The pile of debris was 7 stories high and covered 16 acres. Somewhere under all that wreckage were thousands of people who had not made it out of the buildings in time. Captain Capico had been a firefighter for 15 years, but he had never seen destruction like this. The pile of debris was unstable and dangerous. Pieces of steel beams were sticking out at strange angles. Fires were still burning deep underground. But Captain Capico and his team kept searching because they knew that every minute could mean the difference between life and death for someone trapped below. The rescue operation at Ground Zero began immediately after the towers fell. Firefighters, police officers, construction workers, and volunteers worked around the clock searching for survivors. These were specially trained dogs that could smell people who were trapped under debris. Riley was a golden retriever who worked with his handler, firefighter Chris Christensen. Riley searched through the dangerous pile day after day, looking for signs of life. They would work for hours moving pieces of concrete and twisted metal by hand. The work was slow and careful because they did not want to cause the pile to shift and hurt anyone who might be trapped underneath. Riley and the other dogs were not finding living people, and this made them sad and confused. The dogs were trained to find people who were alive, and when they could not do their job successfully, they became depressed. His job was one of the most difficult at Ground Zero. Dr. Hirsch and his team had to identify the people who had died in the attacks, so their families could have funerals and begin to heal. Sometimes they could identify someone from dental records. Other times they had to use DNA testing, which took weeks or months. Dr. Hirsch knew that families were waiting for news about their loved ones, and he worked as hard as he could to give them answers. This was extremely hard work because the collapse of the buildings had made identification very difficult. The air at the site was filled with dust and smoke that made it hard to breathe. Many workers developed coughs and lung problems from breathing the contaminated air. But most of them refused to leave because they felt responsible for finding the missing people. The dust and chemicals in the air made his eyes burn and his throat hurt. But Lieutenant Kozłowski said he could not stop working while families were still waiting for their loved ones to be found. The handlers had to take special care of their dogs and make sure they got rest and comfort. Her husband worked on the 89th floor of the South Tower and had not been heard from since the morning of September 11th. This meant that workers were no longer looking for people who were alive. Instead, they were trying to recover the remains of people who had died, so their families could have proper funerals. This change was very hard for the rescue workers because it meant giving up hope of finding survivors. Barbara brought her husband's picture and walked around the site asking rescue workers if they had seen him. Even though Barbara knew the chances were small, she could not give up hope. On October 4th, they found a steel beam that formed a perfect cross. This cross became a symbol of hope and faith for many people working at the site. Dr. Robin Gurwitch was a psychologist who came to New York to help rescue workers deal with the trauma they were experiencing. Dr. Gurwitch set up counseling stations near Ground Zero where workers could talk about their feelings and get emotional support. Frank made sure the cross was preserved, and eventually it was placed in the 9/11's Memorial Museum. Workers had to move over 1.8 million tons of debris. Every piece of steel and concrete was carefully examined to make sure no human remains were missed. They were seeing terrible things every day, and it was affecting their mental health. Dr. Gurwitch and other counselors worked around the clock to provide support and help workers process what they were experiencing. On that day, the last piece of steel was removed from the site in a ceremony attended by families, rescue workers, and city officials. The recovery workers had found the remains of 2,753 people, but many families never got their loved ones back. The work was done with respect and dignity, because the workers knew they were handling what was essentially a gravesite for thousands of people. They called this the rescue phase, and everyone hoped they would find people alive under the rubble. For the first few days, rescue workers believed that pockets of survivors might be trapped in spaces under the debris. For 8 months, people from all different backgrounds worked together with one goal: to bring the missing people home to their families. They worked in dangerous conditions, breathed toxic air, and dealt with unimaginable sadness. But they never gave up because they knew that every person who died deserved to be found and remembered with dignity. Frank operated heavy machinery that moved large pieces of debris, but Frank also did something else that was very important. When workers found personal items that belonged to victims, Frank made sure these items were treated with respect. Port Authority police officers John McLaughlin and Will Jimeno were pulled out after being trapped for many hours. Finding these 2 men alive gave hope to all the rescue workers. He knew that these items meant everything to the families of the people who had died. Frank created a special system to catalog and preserve these personal belongings so they could be returned to families. He treated each item as if it belonged to his own family member. If 2 people could survive under the rubble, maybe there were others waiting to be found. They brought pictures of their husbands, wives, children, parents, and friends. They put these pictures on walls and fences around the site. The walls became covered with thousands of photos and messages, like, Have you seen my brother? And please help us find our dad. Captain Scott Kapitko was one of the firefighters leading search teams at Ground Zero. Captain Kapitko's team used special listening devices to try to hear voices calling for help from under the rubble. On September 12th, the day after the attacks, rescue workers found 2 people alive in the debris. The search dogs played an important role in the rescue efforts at Ground Zero. But the work was hard on the search dogs, too. Dr. Charles Hirsch was the chief medical examiner for New York City. Dr. Hirsch worked with dentists, DNA experts, and fingerprint specialists to identify victims. The families of missing people came to Ground Zero every day hoping for news. Barbara Fetzer was one of the family members who came to Ground Zero every day. The rescue workers at Ground Zero were dealing with their own physical and emotional challenges. Lieutenant Michael Kozłowski was a police officer who worked at Ground Zero for 6 months. Lieutenant Kozłowski worked 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. After several weeks, the rescue operation became a recovery operation. The recovery work at Ground Zero took 8 months to complete. Frank Selecchia was a construction worker who spent months working at Ground Zero. Frank found wedding rings, watches, wallets, and photographs in the debris. One of the most famous discoveries at Ground Zero was made by Frank and his team. The psychological impact of working at Ground Zero was enormous. Many of the rescue workers were having nightmares and trouble sleeping. The recovery operation at Ground Zero officially ended on May 30th. The work at Ground Zero showed the best of human nature during the worst of times. More than 20 years have passed since September 11th, 2001. The survivors of that terrible day have lived through decades of healing, growing, and rebuilding their lives. Some have become teachers and speakers who share their stories with others. Some have started new careers helping people in crisis. Others have quietly rebuilt their lives while carrying the memories of that day. All of them have shown incredible strength in creating meaningful lives after experiencing unimaginable trauma. Brian Clark, who saved Stanley Pramnath from the South Tower, went back to work just a few weeks after September 11th. But Brian found that he could not focus on his old job the same way. Even though they had worked in the same building for years, they had never met before September 11th. Now they consider each other brothers. Brian and Stanley often speak together at events, sharing their story of how strangers can become family through acts of kindness. Stanley had been focused on his career in banking, but after surviving the attacks, he realized that helping others was more important than making money. Stanley became a motivational speaker and a minister. He travels around the country telling people about the importance of helping each other and having faith during difficult times. The experience of helping save a life had changed him completely. Brian realized that making money was not as important as helping people and spending time with family. Janelle had broken bones and internal injuries that required many surgeries. The physical healing was hard, but the emotional healing was even harder. She was afraid to go into tall buildings or crowded places. Simple things like hearing a loud noise or seeing an airplane would make her panic. She helps people who have experienced terrible events learn how to heal and rebuild their lives. Lauren was severely burned over 80% of her body and spent months in the hospital fighting for her life. Doctors were not sure if she would survive, but Lauren was determined to live for her husband and young son. Janelle often visits hospitals to talk to patients who are recovering from serious injuries. She tells them that healing takes time, but it is possible to have a good life after trauma. Janelle worked with therapists and counselors to help her deal with these feelings. Slowly, she learned how to manage her fear and anxiety. She had to learn how to walk again and how to use her hands properly. For several years, Tanya was the president of the World Trade Center Survivors Network and spoke at many events about her experience. But investigators later discovered that Tanya had not actually been at the World Trade Center on September 11th. Her story was completely made up. They felt betrayed and angry that someone would pretend to have experienced their trauma. But real survivors used this experience to become even more committed to telling their true stories and helping other genuine survivors. The physical pain was intense, but Lauren never gave up. She said that thinking about her family gave her the strength to keep fighting. She wants people to understand that surviving a tragedy comes with responsibility. The dust and chemicals at Ground Zero caused lung diseases, cancers, and other illnesses in people who were exposed to them. Dr. Benjamin Luft has been studying and treating these health problems for over 20 years. On September 11th, his coworkers carried him down 69 flights of stairs to safety. This experience taught John about the power of teamwork and friendship. After September 11th, John became an advocate for people with disabilities and workplace safety. They have become teachers, advocates, speakers, and helpers. They have started foundations, written books, and dedicated their lives to making the world a better place. Janelle believes that she was saved for a reason, and that reason is to help other people who are struggling. He wanted to make sure that no one would be left behind in an emergency because they needed extra help. They realized that spending time with family and helping others is more important than money or career success. They learned to appreciate small moments of happiness and to not take anything for granted. John's advocacy work led to better safety procedures in buildings all over the country. She has written books about overcoming adversity and finding strength in difficult times. Lauren travels to hospitals, schools, and corporations to share her story. Their stories remind us that human beings have incredible strength and resilience. They show us that it is possible to survive the worst experiences and still find ways to help others and create meaningful lives. She wants people to know that no matter how bad things seem, it is always possible to rebuild and find happiness again. Many of them stay in touch with each other and continue to help each other heal. They meet regularly to share their experiences and support each other through difficult times. They have created a family of people who understand what they have been through. She has written a book about her experience and uses the money from book sales to help other survivors. Brian started speaking at schools and community groups about what happened on September 11th. He wanted young people to understand that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when others need help. Brian always emphasized that he was not a hero for saving Stanley. Stanley says that Brian was like an angel sent to save him. Stanley believes that he survived for a reason, and that reason is to inspire other people to be kind and helpful to each other. Stanley has spoken to thousands of people over the years, sharing his message of hope and survival. He said that anyone would have done the same thing if they had heard someone calling for help. Brian also became close friends with Stanley Premnath, the man he helped rescue. Stanley Premnath also changed his life completely. After September 11th, Stanley often talks about the moment when Brian Clark found him trapped in the debris. Janelle Guzman McMillan, who was the last person pulled alive from the World Trade Center rubble, spent months in the hospital recovering from her injuries. Janelle suffered from nightmares and anxiety for years after September 11th. Today, Janelle works as an advocate for other trauma survivors. Janelle also speaks at schools and churches about her experience. Lauren Manning was a business executive who was entering the North Tower when the first plane hit. Lauren's recovery took years and required dozens of surgeries. Today, Lauren is a successful author and speaker who inspires people all over the world. Lauren also started a foundation that helps burn survivors get the medical care and support they need. She knows how hard the recovery process can be, and she wants to make it easier for other people who are going through similar experiences. Lauren has helped hundreds of burn survivors over the years. Tanya Head became famous as a survivor, who claimed to have escaped from the South Tower. The discovery that Tanya had lied about being a survivor was very painful for real survivors. Many survivors have dealt with serious health problems that developed years after September 11th. Dr. Luft runs a medical program that provides free health care to 9/11 survivors and rescue workers. He has treated thousands of people who developed illnesses related to their exposure to the toxic dust at Ground Zero. Dr. Luft's research has helped doctors understand how disasters can cause long-term health problems and how to treat them. Many survivors have become advocates for better health care for people affected by 9/11s. They have lobbied Congress to pass laws that provide medical treatment and compensation for people who got sick because of their exposure to Ground Zero. These survivors turned their personal struggles into efforts to help others who were suffering. John Abruzzo was a man who used a wheelchair and worked on the 69th floor of the North Tower. John started speaking at companies about the importance of having evacuation plans that include people with disabilities. The survivors of September 11th have shown that it is possible to find meaning and purpose after experiencing terrible trauma. Many survivors say that September 11th changed their priorities completely. The survivors have also shown the importance of community and support. Today, the survivors of September 11th continue to inspire people all over the world. 23 years have passed since September 11th, 2001. But the memory of that day and the heroes it created continues to inspire people all around the world. The legacy of the firefighters, police officers, first responders, and ordinary citizens who showed extraordinary courage has become a permanent part of American history. The memorial consists of two enormous pools that sit in the exact footprints of the North and South Towers. Alice works every day to make sure that the stories of the heroes and victims are told with dignity and respect. The museum has exhibits about the firefighters who climbed the stairs while everyone else was coming down. During this ceremony, the names of all 2,977 victims are read aloud. After September 11th, Frank started an organization called the Tunnel to Towers Foundation. This foundation builds homes for families of fallen first responders and helps wounded veterans. Frank wanted to make sure that his brother's sacrifice would continue to help people long after September 11th. She wants young people to understand that the heroes of September 11th were not special because they had superpowers or special training. They were special because they chose to help others when help was needed most. Sarah tells her students that they have the same capacity for heroism within themselves. Commissioner Negro tells them that heroism is not about being fearless. It is about being afraid but doing the right thing anyway. He reminds them that the firefighters who died on September 11th were scared too, but they kept climbing those stairs because people needed their help. Family members take turns reading the names, and often they add personal messages to their loved ones. The Stephen Siller Children's Foundation provides scholarships for children who want to become firefighters, police officers, or paramedics. The Todd Beamer Foundation helps children whose parents died in military service or as first responders. These memorials are not just about remembering the past. They're about inspiring people today to be ready to help when others need them. Communities have better plans for responding to disasters. These improvements have saved lives in emergencies that have happened since September 11th. Every firefighter who sees a memorial to the 343 is reminded of the courage they are expected to show. The passengers on Flight 93 were not trained soldiers, but they fought back to protect others. Office workers in the towers were not rescue professionals, but they helped strangers get to safety. Boat captains and taxi drivers were not first responders, but they risked their lives to help people evacuate. They have also helped thousands of wounded soldiers who came home from wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Whenever ordinary citizens step up to help during emergencies, they are honoring the memory of the heroes who came before them. The legacy of courage lives on in every act of kindness, every moment of bravery, and every person who chooses to help others when help is needed most. Monica has spent over 20 years making sure that people remember not just that her husband died, but how he lived. It means never forgetting that we all have the capacity to be heroes when the moment calls for it. Michael was the kind of person who always helped others and always tried to make people laugh. Monica says that the best way to honor heroes like Michael is to try to be more like them every day. The heroes of that day showed us that love is stronger than hate, that courage is stronger than fear, and that people who care about each other can overcome even the worst evil. Captain Jonas tells audiences that the real heroes of that day were not just the people who died. She tells people that heroism is not something that only happens during disasters, but they have grown up hearing the stories of the heroes who gave their lives to save others. Many of these young adults say that these stories have shaped their understanding of what it means to be a good person and a good citizen. Heroism happens every time someone chooses to be kind to a stranger, helps a neighbor in need, or stands up for someone who is being treated unfairly. He says that Josephine reminds us that we never know how helping one person might end up helping many others. Captain Jonas believes that every act of kindness and courage creates a ripple effect that can change the world. The real heroes were everyone who chose to help instead of just thinking about themselves. Young people who receive these scholarships often say that they feel a special responsibility to live up to the example set by the heroes they are honoring. Many of them go on to careers in public service, continuing the legacy of helping others. Sarah Johnson is a high school teacher in Ohio who was just a college student when the attacks happened. Every year, Sarah teaches her students about the courage shown by people like Todd Beamer, Rick Rescorla, and the firefighters, who gave their lives to save others. Frank believes that the best way to honor his brother's memory is to continue helping people who serve others, just like Stephen did. These messages are filled with love, pride, and the promise that their heroes will never be forgotten. It tells the story of the passengers on Flight 93 who fought back against the attackers. It honors the memory of people like Wells Crowther, the man in the red bandana, who saved so many lives. Some have become firefighters, police officers, paramedics, and soldiers. Every new recruit learns about the courage and sacrifice of those who came before them. They study the actions of firefighters like Captain Patrick Brown and the men of Ladder Company 6. Others have become teachers, social workers, and doctors. These young people say that learning about September 11th taught them that the most meaningful life is one spent helping others. The museum contains thousands of artifacts from that day, including pieces of the destroyed buildings, personal belongings of victims, and recordings of phone calls made by people who were trapped in the towers. Water falls continuously into these pools, creating a peaceful sound that honors the memory of those who died. Around the edges of each pool are bronze panels with the names of every person who lost their life. On September 11th, their stories are told in schools, remembered at memorials, passed down from parents to children, so that future generations will never forget what real heroism looks like. The National September 11th Memorial and Museum stands where the Twin Towers once reached toward the sky. Alice Greenwald has been the director of the 9/11's Memorial Museum since it opened. Alice believes that the most important part of the museum is not the artifacts, but the stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Every year on September 11th, families of victims and survivors gather at the memorial for a ceremony to remember those who died. Frank Siller lost his brother Stephen, firefighter who died trying to save people in the South Tower. The Tunnel to Towers Foundation has built hundreds of homes for families who lost loved ones in the line of duty. In schools across America, teachers make sure that students learn about September 11th and the heroes of that day. Sarah brings survivors and family members of victims to speak to her students. Many of Sarah's students have been inspired by these stories to choose careers in public service. The Fire Department of New York has made sure that the memory of the 343 firefighters who died on September 11th continues to inspire
new generations of firefighters.
Fire Commissioner Daniel Negro, who was a chief on September 11th, often speaks to new firefighters about what it means to be a hero. The families of September 11th heroes have created many scholarships and foundations to help young people get education and training. These scholarships ensure that the values of courage, service, and sacrifice continue to inspire new generations. At firehouses, police stations, and military bases around the country, memorials honor the first responders who died on September 11th. Captain J. Jonas, who led Ladder Company 6 and survived the collapse of the North Tower, now travels around the country speaking about September 11th. Captain Jonas often talks about Josephine Harris, the woman his company helped evacuate and who ended up saving their lives by slowing them down. The legacy of September 11th has also inspired improvements in emergency preparedness and safety. Buildings now have better evacuation procedures. First responders have better equipment and training. But perhaps the most important legacy of September 11th is the reminder that ordinary people have the power to be heroes. Monica Ican lost her husband Michael, who worked in the South Tower. Monica travels to schools and community groups to talk about her husband and the other heroes of September 11th. The children who were born after September 11th are now adults who never experienced that day directly. The legacy of September 11th reminds us that in our darkest moments, the best of human nature can shine the brightest. Today, whenever first responders rush toward danger to help others, they are carrying on the legacy of September 11th. Never forget means more than just remembering what happened on September 11th.